Welcome back to Anatomy and Physiology on Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoff. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. In this video, we're going to talk about something called the IST complex. Now, IST stands for a number of things. The I is for interspinous ligament, S is for supraspinous ligament, and T is for thoracolumbar fascia. And together, these things, with the help of a few other pieces here and there, form what's called the IST complex. Now, if you do a quick Google search of this, and I know because I've tried doing it several times over the course of a few months, you won't find a lot on the IST complex, probably because there are other IST complexes that have nothing to do with biology or anatomy. Okay? So in this video, we're going to answer what it is and what it's used for. And actually, I think that answering what it's used for first is actually a better way to go, because it may not make a lot of sense if you don't know where it's leading to, what it's used for. And so we're actually going to use an extreme example. We're going to go to the gym. And we're going to do a heavy lift, such as a deadlift like this woman's doing right here, or a squat. Basically something that's putting a tremendous load on the spine, whether directly or indirectly. Now this may not look like it's putting a load on the spine, but if you've ever done a deadlift before, notice that this woman has good form, at least in the back we can say, because the back doesn't appear to be bending forward. Okay? You would know if you're lifting too heavy because you'd kind of have a trunk flexion and your back would have a curvature. Okay? You don't want that. You can seriously injure your deep back muscles doing that. So this flat back is exactly what we want during a deadlift. And so in that respect, you are putting an indirect load on the spine, even though the weight's not on your back. I don't think it matters if you're lifting this amount of weight or 800 pounds in a deadlift. Okay? I think you can easily make an argument that you need pretty good stabilization of your spine. You don't want, during the lift, to look like the wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man from Family Guy. Okay? You want to have good stabilization. And one of the things that the ITS complex does is it does stabilize the spine. Now, I don't care if this is a bodybuilder or just a regular lifter, you're lifting yourself, whatever it may be. What does everybody do when they're doing a lift like this? A deadlift, a squat, anything that's really, really heavy, even Olympic lifts. You do what's called the Valsalva maneuver. And I don't really have time to go into the Valsalva maneuver here, but it suffices to say that it's a move where you're expiring against a closed glottis. Okay, there's a lot of activities where you could do the Valsalva maneuver. Going to the gym and lifting heavy is a great example where you might do that. Also, if you're straining to defecate, don't want to be gross there, but a lot of people will do the Valsalva maneuver. That's actually what killed Elvis Presley. Okay, but the point is that Valsalva maneuver, through mechanisms we're about to talk about, is going to play an important role in stabilizing your spine. Okay. The Valsalva maneuver, what it will do for the spine is it will make the spine rigid. It will help compress the viscera in the abdominal cavity, so all the organs that are in there, compress those. And overall, it just makes the torso more stable. Why do you want the torso and the spine stable and the abdominal viscera compressed? Because you don't want to be waving around like the wacky waving inflatable arm flailing tube man. You want to be stable. The key is stability, and the IST complex facilitates that. Okay? Now, this is a fairly detailed picture up here. Over here on the right side of this picture, this is actually going to be the anterior abdominal wall. Not every piece here is important for our purposes in the ITS complex, but notice we have several muscles here, the superficial external obliques. We have the middle internal obliques, and then the deepest one is the transverse abdominis. Now, the transverse abdominis is going to be the one that's going to be more important here for the IST complex. Okay? If we loop this transverse abdominis around from anterior, around the lateral side to the posterior side, nearer the spine, what we would see is that the transverse abdominis muscle, let me actually zoom in a little bit here, the transverse abdominis here is actually going to connect to this fibrous connective tissue called the thoracolumbar fascia. So all this sort of grayish white tissue that kind of goes around here and surrounds these muscles, all this is all thoracolumbar fascia. Okay? And there's multiple layers to it. Right here, this would be the anterior layer, and notice it's anterior because over on the right side, this is the anterior side of this section. So this is the anterior thoracolumbar fascia. This one right here is the middle layer of the thoracolumbar fascia, And it's actually going to separate these two muscles right here. This muscle right here would be the quadratus lumborum muscle. And this right here is likely multifidus. And the reason I know it's multifidus, even though it's not labeled, is because multifidus is going to originate on transverse processes. And this is actually the transverse process of this vertebra right here in the lumbar region. Okay, so this is likely multifidus. Also, multifidus is involved with the IST complex. Okay, and then these muscles right here, this is the erector spinae muscle group. And the point is that right here we have the middle thoracolumbar fascia, and back here is going to be the posterior layer of the thoracolumbar fascia. Okay, and when we're looking at the transverse abdominis right here, transverse abdominis is going to connect to that thoracolumbar fascia. Now I've zoomed back out so we can see everything, but it suffices to say when the transverse abdominis contracts, it's actually going to pull kind of in this direction. Okay, it's going to pull from here toward this, and it's going to pull on that thoracolumbar fascia. And we can't see the other side of it over here, but it would do the same thing on the other side. And the reason I mentioned that the transverse abdominis contracts is because when you perform the Valsalva maneuver and you're trying to stabilize your spine, you have a natural contraction of the transverse abdominis muscle. So make sure to keep that in mind. So now let's go down here. This is a lumbar vertebra. This is a superior view, okay, and it's in the lumbar region because that's where the IST complex exists. All right. So if we go up the vertebral column on the spinous processes, the tips that is, we have the supraspinous ligament. That, remember, connects the tips of each spinous process. Then, going posteriorly, we have the interspinous ligament. And recall the interspinous ligament exists between two successive spinous processes and kind of goes between the lengths of them. Okay. And then right here we have ligamentum flavum. Now remember, the ligamentum flavum is going to connect the lamina regions of two successive vertebrae. So it doesn't look like it here, but if we stacked another vertebra, another lumbar vertebra on top of this, the ligamentum flavum, at least this part of it, would actually be in the vertebral canal. Okay? Now think about this. What is in the vertebral canal? The spinal cord. And also, because of the nature of the ligamentum flavum, part of it is also in the vertebral canal. So two things in there, hold that in mind. The ligamentum flavum and, of course, the spinal cord. Now, coming back to the transverse abdominis. Transverse abdominis would kind of be over here in this region, okay? And remember, when it contracts, it pulls on the thoracolumbar fascia. Now, the way the thoracolumbar fascia attaches to the supraspinous ligament is kind of like this, okay? So I want you to imagine for a second the transverse abdominis contracting and pulling the thoracolumbar fascia. Look how both sides of the thoracolumbar fascia attach to the supraspinous ligament. If you're pulling the thoracolumbar fascia, this one is going to be pulling in this direction, like that. And so, yeah, it's going to be pulling toward the right in this image, but also it's going to be pulling posteriorly. Because if you're pulling this direction, it has both a right component and a posterior component, right? Okay. If this one is being pulled by this transverse abdominis, the direction of the pull on the supraspinous ligament is going to be like this. And so this also has a posterior component. In other words, it's not as apparent here in this picture, but when the transverse abdominis contracts, the net effect is the thoracolumbar fascia is kind of being pulled posteriorly. Okay? It's being pulled in this direction. Now, this is a situation where it's kind of like, you had that song as a kid, the foot bone's connected to the ankle bone, which is connected to the shin bone, and so on and so forth, yada, yada, yada. Well, when the thoracolumbar fascia has a net pull in the posterior direction, it pulls the supraspinous ligament with it. And then that pulls the interspinous ligament with that. And then that pulls the ligamentum flavum posteriorly. And why might that be important? Well, if you're loading the spine, right, you don't want the spinal cord to be compressed. Well, pulling the ligamentum flavum backwards is actually going to arbitrarily create an increased diameter of the vertebral canal, and it helps prevent the ligamentum flavum from buckling into the spinal cord and compressing it. So pulling everything back posteriorly kind of flattens this part of the ligamentum flavum and sort of widens the vertebral canal enough to where it helps prevent compression of the spinal cord. And that's something very important. Now, If it wasn't enough for the transverse abdominis to be pulling on the thoracolumbar fascia and having a net posterior pull on the thoracolumbar fascia, the multifidus also plays a role. Recall that the multifidus actually has an important stabilization role in the spine, but when it contracts, it actually pushes the thoracolumbar fascia posteriorly. Well, we already had a pull posteriorly due to the transverse abdominis, so we're just going to augment that with the push of the multifidus. And so we have two muscles pushing this backward, which also help aid in the net pull of the ligamentum flavum backward. And so one of the big functions here, if we're really talking about the spinal cord during a heavy lift like this when we want extreme stability, is the ITS complex and the multifidus collectively, by their actions on the thoracolumbar fascia, they actually prevent the ligamentum flavum from buckling into the vertebral canal and compressing the spinal cord. And that's extremely important. And of course, when you contract the transverse abdominis, that's going to also play a role in compressing the abdominal viscera from the anterior side. You don't want your abdominal viscera moving around and being all loose in there when you're loading the spine like this, right? It might cause some damage. So you compress those viscera, and that's one of the functions or actions of the transverse abdominis. And the other thing that happens is, of course, that this system will help stabilize the spine, okay? Particularly in the lumbar region, because that's where the IST complex exists. If you go above the lumbar region into the thoracic and the cervical regions, you don't have the IST complex up there. But overall, when you're performing the Valsalva maneuver, you have all of these back muscles that are going to be contracting. They're your extensor muscles in the back, and they help stabilize the spine. Now, that's not technically part of the IST complex, but we really can't talk about this without talking about those other things. Okay? So just a quick recap of what we're talking about here. Right? So our IST complex, we've got the thoracolumbar fascia attached to the supraspinous ligament, which is attached to the interspinous ligament, which is then attached to the ligamentum flavum. And so when we need to brace our core and prepare for stabilizing the spine, which we might see during a heavy lift, and we also would do when we're performing the Valsalva maneuver and making everything more rigid, the transverse abdominis and the multifidus collectively are going to have a net movement of the thoracolumbar fascia posteriorly, which is going to pull all this stuff with it in the posterior direction. And then that ligamentum flavum, which this part of it is in the vertebral canal, okay, it's going to pull it backwards and sort of flatten it, so to speak, which is going to allow the diameter of the vertebral canal to be maximized, and that helps prevent the spinal cord from being compressed and preventing the ligamentum flavum from buckling into the vertebral canal. Okay, so hopefully this made sense to you. Please make sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel for future videos and notifications. Thank you very much.